I'd intended to come dressed for my part of my story I wanted to tell you today, but as Craig explained, they've got a plane to catch, and I couldn't quite pull it off. But when I saw how Mo's turned out, it made me kind of wish I'd found a way to do it. My story today is one that's always been of personal interest to me. And throughout my life in the Kootenays and the Slocan Valley, I've had an interest in local history. As Craig explained, my dad's side of the family was here for a long time and did a number of things. It actually turns out that the site of where this building is and north of the road that goes across the bridge and just south of here was the Passmore Lumber Company, or Burns Lumber Company sawmill was on this site. And I have the good fortune of having photographs of when all that was here. My mom's side of the family had an interesting thing as well. They settled in Argenta just after the turn of the century. They'd been dirt farmer immigrants from England that lived through a Dust Bowl. And my grandmother told me that they had a team of horses, a team of oxen, and one of each died. So her dad left Saskatchewan with the one of each on the train and headed up to the rich fruitland country that they thought it was in Argenta, and made a cabin for them there while the neighbors looked after her mom and the other two little kids. Actually, one was born while he was gone. And she arrived on the Moye to a signal fire at night on the beach at Johnson Landing. And the guys were up in the cabin playing cards and didn't really realize a boat had come in. So they dropped the gangplank and shipped them down and stuffed her off with her trunk on the shore and pulled up the plank and sailed away. And she waited down there 15 minutes before they got their act together to get out of the cabin and go check and see if the boat had come. So that's kind of where my people came from. I've always enjoyed the company of old-timers, particularly when I was younger, and there were a lot more of them. Before the modern times of electronic entertainment, storytelling was a real big deal in the Slocan Valley. I see Barbara and Rory there. They would have had exactly what I grew up with. We had neighbors and friends like old Gene Hurd and his wife Mary, Don Hurd and Dorothy, Irv Anderson, all kinds of people. And what a lot of them had in common with me, and part of my theme, is a lot of them had been trappers as part of their career and had trap lines. But where I'm going with this is, before the modern electronic age, where people did their own thing in their own place, people sat around and told stories. It's just what you did. So you drank a lot of tea, and you went out to the outhouse quite a bit because there was a lot of tea went through. But the stories were consistent. You know, sometimes you'd hear them a year later, or someone new would come, and you'd hear the story again. And a lot of it is the local history that maybe didn't get written down, or if you see it written down, it might be from someone else's perspective. And it was just a real treasure of a time to have people share those things with you. And there's all kinds of historic events, like the year that the Slocan Lake froze, or the major fires. Gene and Don Hurd would tell stories about sneaking across to the Arrow Lakes side to see if they could poach a marten or two down the other guy's side of the divide and on his trap line. And when they came back, they found that he'd passed them in the snow in the night and was raiding their traps. There's just so many interesting things that went on here. But it was that really brought about my interest to have a trap line. So as a young man, I figured by hook or by crook, I got to get a trap line. I want to enjoy this experience that these people spoke of. And, you know, there's all kinds of things. People have different ideas about fur and all that, but the whole lore and mystique about being out there alone and doing what you do was the thing that fascinated me. So I talked to old Mr. Ewart at McCusk, was the game warden, and it came around and said I was interested in a trap line. He told me that he'd watch out, and it turned out that Perry Connett from New Denver had realized he was too old to trap his line, and they were going to take it away from him. So he wanted an assistant trapper, so I would go visit old Perry, and he'd tell me his stories. And his father had had the trap line from the time of the inception of registered trap lines in BC. And he had an old grudge with Gene Peterson from Sandon because at some point in the past, his father had sold off part of the trapline to Tony the Trapper, who was this famous trapper from the Sandon area, and Gene was bequeathed Tony the Trapper's trapline. So to make a long story short, I poached some of Gene's martins inadvertently by not knowing where I was, but he was running his claims up in Cane Creek, and he saw that someone was going in on skis before daylight in the morning and coming out on skis after he'd come out at night. He thought something was wrong with that. This just couldn't be. And I used to take the old traditional bug, doing it traditionally, a candle in a can, and ski up Cane Creek on my bushwhacker skis, and it took that long to get into the back and get out to come home at night. So he laid for me one day, and I'm coming down, and it's 9 o'clock at night, and there's a guy with a fire and a teapot going, and so he says, "Hey, sit down," and you're coming out of the blue, and at that time, no one cross-country skied there. There was just no one there. So we sat down, and he wanted to know who I was and what I was doing, and he pretty much said, "I think you're poaching Perry's line." I said, "No, actually, I'm trapping it for him as an assistant. It's all legal and whatnot." And he must have thought pretty highly of that, because the next time I saw him, he invited me to, I said, "Actually, I have 2 marten that should be yours, and I needed to find you, but I didn't know how," kind of a thing, "and I'll bring them to you." So I went up to his place to take him the 2 marten, and he said that he thought it was time to bury the hatchet with old Perry, and he said, "People have been beating my door down for years to get this trap line, and I wouldn't sell it. But he said, what we're going to do is join these 2 lines back together and give them to you." So that's how I came about getting my trap line. But the neat thing that came from that was, every time I went trapping, I would come to one or the other of these old gentlemen's places with things that I had seen while I was out, and to show them my fur and see how it compared to what they'd caught in the past or that sort of thing. And they started sharing stories about what had gone on in the area. So that really is what inspired my interest in our local history. How am I doing for time, Craig?
Great.
So this is where I'm going. This is my take of the beginning of the silver rush in the Slocan. So it's kind of the time after the heyday of the Indians and before the Duke of Wars is kind of the time frame that I'm looking at. In September of 1891, 2 fellas named Carpenter and Seaton, Eli Carpenter and Jack Seaton, were off looking at a place, and it's quoted in all the history books as a place further north, where there was some outcroppings of rich galena ore. And they didn't find that there, but as they were on their way back, they had actually come out of Ainsworth through Caslow and up Cane Creek. So they were on a mountaintop. They actually got onto Payne Mountain above Sandon, and they were looking for a shortcut back to Ainsworth, is what they were doing. But they saw the Slocan Lake, and they didn't know what it was at the time. There had been talk, someone said maybe there was a big lake up that valley, but no one really knew. It wasn't local knowledge. So out in the main valleys, like Nelson, Castlegar, for about 20 years, people had been mucking around with trains and stern wheelers and building the infrastructure to get close. These fellas go up there, and they find this wonderful galena float, which is your rich silver, lead, zinc ore. And they thought, boy, this is it. So they head her down to Ainsworth, and that's where the assay office is. And Seaton was a blabbermouth and a friendly, jovial guy, and just happy-go-lucky, would share anything with anybody. And Carpenter, he actually had an interesting history. He was a former circus performer from France, of all things, and came out here as a prospector. So, but he was quite secretive, and so while Jack Seaton was in the bar blabbing about their good fortune, but not saying exactly where it was and not too worried about it, Carpenter took the samples to the assay office and, "Here, let me look after this," because he wasn't a drinker and the other guy was. And he came back and said, "Geez, sorry, yeah, it's garbage, it's leverite, that stuff's no good." So that's kind of in a nutshell what happened there initially. Well, Carpenter didn't want to be involved with this guy. He thought, he's going to sink me. So he made plans with another fella who was known to be tight-lipped, and they were overheard by a hotel owner as they were making their escape, and they were going to head down to Nelson. And he guessed, he didn't know for a fact, but he guessed that the big river between the Kootenay and the Columbia, or along the Kootenay, was going to connect to the Slocan, and he was going to go up that way and go back there. So this was September of 1891, so it's nice weather, everything's fair and the whole thing. So he takes off, leaves the community, and in the meantime, this hotel owner, he twigged Seton. He said, you know, there's something wrong with this. I overheard this, and you know, you should check this out. You know where it is. So he took on a couple of partners, Jack Seton did, and he had a couple of other fellas. Bill Hennessy was the famous one, and he had a brother, and some fellas, Flint and McGuigan. And so 5 of them took off from Ainsworth. They went up to Caslow, and in 1891, from all accounts, Caslow had a few tents on the beach. That was it. That's all that was there. So these guys head up Cane Creek, and because he knows exactly where he's going, they go up there, and they find it. It is just an amazing claim. There's outcroppings everywhere. And because of the claim staking law at the time, you can only stake a claim of a certain size on each side of a divide, but each man could get one. So they actually nailed it. They hit every good claim along the ridge and had it staked. And because they felt themselves to be somewhat noble, because the other guy was a bit of a schemer, they called it the Noble Five. And that's the history of that Noble Five claim. That was the beginning of the whole thing. So they went back to town to register their claim at the assay office, because that's what you had to do to hold it. And in the meantime, the word got out, and people headed for the hills like wildfire. There was miners all over the place. So it actually, as they went into the later fall of 1891, the word had got out so quickly that Bill Hunter and a partner, Fred Hume, who had the Hume Hotel in Nelson, they realized what was going to happen. This was what all this infrastructure with stern wheel boats down to Bonner's Ferry was coming towards, and that was the Great Northern Railway. The Canadian Pacific Railway on the Arrow Lakes had their own thing going with their stern wheelers, and there was a big competition for this. So these fellas said, it's going to happen. So this Bill Hunter, he loaded up 2 boats. He had one built and loaded another one, and took on a partner in Nelson. And at that time, the train was already running between Nelson and Castlegar. So they put these 2 boats on the train, loaded with supplies. When they got to the Slocan River crossing, they had the train guys stop the train, help them get the boats down to the water, all their supplies, loaded up these boats, and they headed up the Slocan River. So this is only a month after this discovery. These guys are heading up there, and they've got all this stuff. And they had flour and beans and bacon and everything that the miners would need. So it actually took them 5 days of long lining the boats up the shores and pushing and pulling and rowing where they could, where the water was slow, to get to just north of the mouth of Lemon Creek, where the river was kind of low and slow like it is now. And then that same afternoon, they made it to the beach at Slocan. So that was in October of 1891. The next day, they got as far as Bannock Point, which is the famous Bannock Point just south of Silverton, and made a bannock there. And the morning after that, they passed Silverton, they got out, had a look around, like, oh, nice place. But this isn't the description of Carpenter's Creek, because it was supposed to be a big, wide valley, is what they heard. So they went up, and when they got to the beach of Carpenter Creek at New Denver, there was already a whack of men had come over from Caslow and were building log cabins and tent frames and going to set up there for the winter. So their arrival was timely because they had all these supplies and a captive market for them. So that's how things went into the winter of 1891. So we've gone from the discovery to into the winter. In the spring of 1892, Mike Grady came over from Nicosia. He was the guy who built the big hotel at St. Leon, which is actually where my wife's family had the hotel, and she did some of her growing up. And he'd staked the big claim that would become the standard above Silverton. By April of 1892, Johnny Harris had arrived on snowshoes at the site of Sandon, right up in that deep, dark valley. And anybody who's been to Sandon in the wintertime knows that the sun doesn't shine for about 3 months of the year, for most of it. And if there's ever a place where there's snow and it's deep and dark, it's there. So he cleared away the snow, and he set up his tent. He staked a claim. He ended up building a hotel, and he built the power plant, which was actually the second one in BC to provide electric light to a municipality. And that happened really shortly thereafter. By November of 1892, Hume, Hunter and McKinnon, Slocan Trading and Navigation Company, launched the William Hunter. They actually came up, sawed the boards to build a boat at Slocan, and brought in the engines by pack horses from the Cusp, because the CP rail had access to get them in, and put that boat in. So it was like a year and a month after the silver was first discovered that the William Hunter was running up and down the Slocan Lake regularly. The railways, by 1895, there were 2 railways constructed and serving Sandon on a daily schedule. So just put this in perspective. Imagine the effort, the infrastructure it took to deliver locomotives, steel rail, saw the timbers, blast the rock. The amount of manpower to do that was incredible. Prior to the K&S coming over from Caslow and the CPR coming from the Cusp, they used the Caslow one as a pack trail because they didn't have they were held up by permitting. The permitting took longer than it took to build the railway. So when they did get that in, they had 800 horses from all accounts daily packing from Caslow to Sandon. Just picture that. So, and you know what the length of the winters are in that area. So the train was absolutely essential because they had to get the hay to feed the horses. By the time 1895 came and the train was there were 5,000 men in Sandon and 5,000 mules and horses. The amount of hay that had to come from the prairies, get onto a train car, get onto a stern wheeler, get onto another train to get there just boggles my mind. The meat that was needed to feed those men is what started, not related to my family, but the Burns Meat Company. Pat Burns set up, and you'll see the Burns block in Nelson has the cow's head on it there on Baker Street. That was Burns Meats, and that was all due to the silver rush at Sandon. So there's all this fascinating stuff going on. In the Slocan Valley, the train was a little slower because of Levido Flats. Now again, we drive across Levido Flats today and no one thinks twice about it. But if you look at the overlanded fill that goes across Levido Flats to have raised that train grade or a highway, think of the amount of volume of material that is. It was a cedar swamp. When you talk to old Don Hurd or old Gene Hurd or old Southland, they say, oh yeah, that was all cedar trees and dark and swampy to go across there. So the road to Slocan, originally the pack trail, wagon road, went actually up the Little Slocan Valley, through the Little Slocan, and down through our farm. So on the survey of the lot just behind our farm, which is my woodlot license, in 1906, it says Old Wagon Road with 2 G's to Slocan City. And it's reputed that the first piano that ever went into Sandon was packed on the back of a guy who took it through that wagon road and got it on the boat to take it up to Sandon. So that's kind of my story, and it's just to paint that picture of how much happened in how short a time. And there will be people here today saying, well, you haven't been here very long, or whatever they think. Well, in less than 5 years, from basically no European people being here to having huge cities with infrastructure, electric lights, trains, it boggles my imagination. And that's what I really wanted to share with you folks today was just that idea. There's stern wheelers, horses brought by the carload, and the claim from the, just so to put in perspective the value of the silver from the Slocan, that prior to the hard rock mining of silver in the Slocan, all the mining in BC was placer mining. And it was gold, and it was in everybody's hands, and no royalty went from the government. I've yet to find it in writing, but I've heard it from numerous sources that it was the royalties from the silver in the Slocan that financed the construction of the Parliament buildings in Victoria, as we know it. That's where the revenue came from. By 1984, according to the mines branch, there was over $325 million of ore that left the Slocan Valley, the majority of it before 1920. That's my story.